but yeah, with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to be presenting tonight is called the circle model of addiction, or the cyclone model. And really what this is just a conceptual model that I use to explain addiction and alcoholism as a disease. So this is an illness, it's a mental illness that a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around and understanding. And especially accepting that it is a disease. A lot of times it can feel like it's a choice, or it's a willpower issue, or it's a moral issue. And so understanding addiction or alcoholism as a disease is really critical in, one, for the addict or the alcoholic, in having some understanding and also some compassion for themselves. And it also really helps family members in terms of how to interact with an addict or an alcoholic, what to expect. It can be useful in setting boundaries, and also I think just adding towards compassion overall for addicts and alcoholics who are struggling. So I usually begin by gauging from a room how many people understand that addiction is a disease. The way that my screen is set up, I can only see like a couple people. So I can just speak from my own experience that I personally struggled understanding that addiction was a disease. So I am in recovery myself. And when I was initially diagnosed with alcoholism, I really resisted the disease model, and I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that addiction was a disease. So if you're struggling with that, or if you have a loved one who struggles with that, it's really common in the journey, I think, of accepting alcoholism and addiction. So just to put things into a little bit of context, I find this to be really helpful before diving into the model, or before even beginning to describe what alcoholism or addiction is that this is not like a new phenomenon that started like in the last generation. Alcoholism and addiction has been in existence throughout human history. So this is something that people have struggled with. As long as alcohol has been around, alcoholics have been around. So there's been people like me who cannot control their drinking regardless of the consequences or the desire to stop. And throughout history, we have baffled people with our behavior. So I would often describe that, like, if you were a doctor in the 1800s, you would be dealing with alcoholics regularly. And in the medical community, addicts and alcoholics were considered doomed. Like, there was no such thing as recovery for an addict or an alcoholic. At times, if we would see, and this you continue to see this, that if someone is in the grips of alcoholism and addiction, sometimes they can put down the drink or the drug for a period of time. And during that period of time, they would be frequently referred to as what's called a dry drunk. And if you haven't heard that term before, a dry drunk is a person who's, they put down a drink or the drug temporarily, which is very hard to do, but they're able to do it for a period of time. And during that period of time, like, we call it like white knuckling it, like they're fighting themselves on a day-to-day basis not to pick up their substance. Usually it's a pretty miserable person, a pretty grumpy person, and usually it's just a matter of time before they fall off the wagon. So I'm not sure, I'm guessing most of you heard that saying before. So there really wasn't any treatment for addicts and alcoholics throughout human history. Even at the rare occasions when an addict and alcoholic could put down the drink or the drug, they were pretty miserable during that period of time. And it was really only a matter of time until they fell off the wagon, so to speak. So, it looked pretty hopeless for addicts and alcoholics. And that's why in the medical community, they were frequently considered doomed, that this was a chronic illness that would progress and eventually usually would lead to incarceration or death. Now that all changes in the 1940s when the program Alcoholics Anonymous comes into existence. So there was no such thing really as recovery for an addict or alcoholic. And then once we see Alcoholics Anonymous come into existence, we begin to see recovery. And so what happens, which I think is a really cool story, if you're not familiar with the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's really fascinating. But basically what happens is a group of drunks, so a group of alcoholics, kind of put together some pieces of a puzzle and realized that collectively together, if they were helping each other and helping other addicts and alcoholics recover, they could continue the momentum into sobriety. So they got together, the first 100 addicts and alcoholics who were sober got together and they wrote a book. And in that book, they wrote down precisely how they recovered from what is a hopeless state of mind and body. And they wrote a book that we hope probably most of you know about today. That book is called Alcoholics Anonymous. We refer to it as the Big Book. And what it is it's more than it's written by more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body to show other alcoholics precisely how we have is covered as the main purpose of this book. So this book is considered like the basic text in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and in recovery. And in here, they outline how to go through the 12 steps. Which I'm going to talk about, I think, briefly towards the end of this. All right, so that's sort of the background of, when I put things into context for understanding addiction and alcoholism. You might have noticed I'm going to be using the word addict and alcoholic and alcoholism and addiction interchangeably. And I don't do that to confuse you guys. I just do that because regardless of what a person's drug of choice is, we're talking about the same disease, the disease of chemical dependency or the disease of substance use disorder. And so addict usually just refers to someone who's addicted to a different substance. Obviously, alcoholics are addicted to alcohol, but I use those terms interchangeably because I'm talking about the same disease. All right, so in this model of addiction that we're going to be talking about, it's going to generally explain the patterns that every alcoholic has gone throughout human history. And it's important to understand that this is a two-part disease. So the first part that I'm going to be speaking about has to do with the body. So the body of an addict or an alcoholic is going to have a different physical reaction to drugs and alcohol than the body of a non-addict, non-alcoholic. And you will see evidence of this different physical reaction when an addict or an alcoholic takes their first drink or their first drug. Okay, and so I'm not talking about the first drink or the first drug that someone takes in their life. I'm talking about the first drink or the first drug that someone takes after any period of sobriety. So the first drink of the weekend, the first hit of after 6 months being sober. So it's when you're introducing a chemical into what was a clean system, right? So what's going to happen inside the body of an addict or an alcoholic is we're almost immediately going to have an acute physical craving for more that surpasses mental control. And that's not going to happen inside the body of a non-addict, non-alcoholic, okay? So the body of an alcoholic is different than the body of a non-alcoholic, and therefore they will have a different reaction to drugs and alcohol. The best way that I describe this is, so if I was going to imagine a beer in front of me right now. So let's say I go to the bar and I order a beer. And I imagine that beer being halfway done. Okay, so I'm going to imagine in front of me a halfway done beer. What I'm experiencing just imagining that, and this is after like over a decade of being sober, I'm having a anxiety just thinking about a halfway done beer, because what I'm feeling is, where is the next drink coming from? I'm not listening to you, the person I'm there with, anymore. I'm watching the bartender. I'm seeing, what do you have here? What's the strongest? How much money do I have left? Where am I going after this? What do I have left at home? Okay, so that's what's going through my mind when I think of a halfway done beer. Okay, now I didn't realize that my peers who were drinking and partying alongside of me weren't having this reaction to drugs and alcohol. Substance abuse is a part of our culture. Okay, so it is common for adolescents to abuse drugs and alcohol. It's common for college students to abuse drugs and alcohol. It's common for adults to abuse drugs and alcohol. But an addict or an alcoholic is having an abnormal reaction to this common substance, right? And again, it's going to be highlighted through something called the phenomenon of craving. Something takes over us when we drink or use, and it wants more. And an addict or an alcoholic cannot predict with any validity how much we're going to have once we start. So I don't know if I'm going to have one drink or if I'm going to have 20 drinks. I can't predict with any validity what's going to happen once I start. Whereas my peers who might like to party, they can predict with validity how much they're going to have any given night. I can't predict with any validity how much I'm going to have once I start. Okay. And again, this is the manifestation of a craving that's ignited the moment an addict and alcoholic introduces the chemical into their system. This is a really good red flag that I think you can notice sometimes even at a young age. If the moment you start drinking or using, you feel like a pretty overwhelming desire to have more than you had originally planned, or if you often can't predict how much you're going to have, that's something to be aware of. And I think that this is something that's really important educating young people about as well. So this would be a really good early indicator that you might be having a different reaction than your peers. Okay. And there is like this kind of misconception that it's just like, oh, you love drugs and alcohol so much. Well, a lot of people love drugs and alcohol. A lot of people really enjoy the way it makes you feel. But with addicts and alcoholics, there is that element to it, but more than that, you can't predict how much you're going to have. So there's this kind of overwhelming desire to have more once you have a chemical in your body. And that really goes outside of willpower. It goes out, because once you're inebriated, it's hard to control those things, but it's just something to be aware of. Okay, so this is again an acute physical craving for more that surpasses mental control. And we call this an allergy because an allergy is an abnormal reaction to a common substance. Okay. And again, drugs and alcohol are common substances. Many people use these substances over the course of their life. Many people abuse these substances over the course of their life. But an addict and alcoholic is going to have an abnormal reaction. And this is something I think is really important to embrace and to understand. Is it possible that the addict and the alcoholic in your life is having a very different response to the chemical than you as a family member are having? Is it possible that me as an alcoholic am having a different reaction to alcohol than my peers, even if they're partying right alongside of me? Okay. So Dr. Silkworth, this was Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson was one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. His doctor was Dr. William Silkworth. This guy worked almost exclusively with chronic alcoholics, and he was the one who educated Bill Wilson about the nature of his condition. So when Bill Wilson got sober and started writing the book Alcoholics Anonymous, he asked Dr. William Silkworth to write the foreword. So this is a quote from the foreword inside the book Alcoholics Anonymous, called The Doctor's Opinion. And I always recommend to anyone who's curious about alcoholism and addiction to read the book Alcoholics Anonymous. at least the first 164 pages, you just get a really good understanding about the disease, about what it's like, and also about the history of it. So Dr. William Silkworth wrote, and he was talking about alcoholics, so he said, they all have one symptom in common. They cannot start drinking without developing the phenomenon of craving. This phenomenon, as we have suggested, may be the manifestation of an allergy, which differentiates these people and sets them apart as a distinct entity. It has never been, by any treatment with which we are familiar, permanently eradicated. The only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. Okay. So he makes a couple really important points here. He says that he talks about the phenomenon of craving. He calls it an allergy. And what he means by allergy is it's an abnormal reaction to a common substance. He says they are different from their non-alcoholic counterparts, and the only solution is abstinence. And what that means is, and we've actually known this for a long time, this isn't new, but once diagnosed, the solution is not learn how to use in moderation. Okay, the solution is entire abstinence. And that is, that's really hard, especially for addicts and alcoholics to accept. Okay, but we've known that the solution is entire abstinence. I'm going to get into why that is later in this presentation. Okay, so here, if you look over where we start, like at the base of the arrows, that's the beginning of the cycle. And what marks the beginning of the cycle is when an addict or alcoholic puts a drink or a drug into their system. So they put a drink or a drug into their body. First sip, first hit, first pill, whatever, puts that drink or drug into a clean system. It ignites the allergy. Okay, it ignites that phenomenon of craving, which is an abnormal reaction to a common substance. Okay. Now I often talk about when I started understanding alcoholism and what I had going on as different from my peers who partied with me. And one time I asked one of my girlfriends who was, she partied heavily. She had some consequences, so she just kind of stopped. And whereas like I kept ending up getting institutionalized. And I asked her, what does it feel like for you to drink alcohol? And she said, well, it's a pleasurable feeling. I feel my inhibitions go down. I start to feel like a little funny, a little weird, a little out of control. The more I drink, the more out of control I feel. I start to feel, confused, out of it, weird, different, and then I'll feel like nauseous or tired. And that is not the experience that I have from with drugs and alcohol. Okay, to say it's a pleasurable experience would be an understatement. When I drink alcohol or use substances, it's like my mind expands. I feel like I can think clearly. I'm interested and I'm motivated. I feel like colors are popping and music sounds perfect and I can connect to people when on my own I can't connect to people. And I feel more in control and right and empowered the more I drink, the more I use. There's not a feeling of being out of control or weird or odd or different. I wouldn't like to drink if that's how it made me feel. Okay. When a non-alcoholic drinks alcohol, they feel intoxicated. But when an alcoholic drinks alcohol, we feel corrected. And that's an abnormal reaction to a common substance. Alcohol and drugs shouldn't make you feel corrected. They shouldn't make you feel like you can think clearer. They shouldn't make you feel like you're more in control. Okay, because these are supposed to be making you feel inebriated. All right. So another good red flag to recognize if you might be inclined to be having issues with drugs and alcohol is if when you drink or use, you feel in control. You feel like you might perform better on a test. You feel like you might be able to perform tasks better. That's an abnormal reaction. Okay. If you talk to someone whose drug of choice is like opiates, for example. I don't know if anyone here has ever had a surgery and had to take opiates, but these are, they're depressants. They should make you feel groggy and woozy and out of it when you take an opiate. But if you talk to someone whose drug of choice is opiates, they're probably going to tell you that when they take an opiate, or initially when they first started using the drug, they felt corrected and energized. And that's an abnormal reaction to that substance. Okay. So here we have a non-addict, non-alcoholic. So what you'll notice with people who identify as non-addicts, non-alcoholics is when they take the first hit, okay, they're going to feel, most people will feel like a pleasurable feeling, a feeling of inhibitions going down, like a warm feeling. And then as you have more drinks, so drink 3, 4, 5, 6, however many, you're going to start to feel out of control, confused, disconnected, tired, and weird. Just you're going to not feel like yourself. You'll feel like funny. Okay. And I can tell you that if that was how alcohol made me feel, I would not like alcohol. I don't like feeling weird. I don't like feeling out of control at all. Okay. So this would be the reaction that we would see from addicts and alcoholics. So when an addict or alcoholic takes their first sip, they're introducing the chemical into their body, you're going to feel pretty quickly that phenomenon of craving. So I want more. And as you drink more, so drink 3, 4, 5, 6, you're feeling in control, empowered, connected, normal, and content. Okay. So this is an abnormal reaction to drugs and alcohol. And again, these would be kind of red flags, but it highlights that we're having a different experience from these substances than our non-addict, non-alcoholic counterparts. What's confusing is a lot of times we're presenting the same, so we can look under the influence. And also what's confusing is non-addicts and non-alcoholics also really enjoy drugs and alcohol sometimes. So a non-addict, non-alcoholic will often try to relate to the alcoholic using their experiences with drugs and alcohol, thinking that they can understand. Okay. And that's where a lot of there's like a big breakdown in communication and understanding and compassion, because there's not that awareness that they're having very different experience with these substances. Okay. So as a result of this phenomenon of craving, as a result of the fact that we feel enhanced by these substances, we often start abusing them more and more, which creates unmanageability. That's our word for consequences. So addicts and alcoholics start to accumulate consequences as a result of chronic substance abuse. Okay, now what's interesting about the accumulation of consequences for addicts and alcoholics is that most people, if you have a certain amount of consequences, you will see a behavior change. In fact, for most addicts and alcoholics, in every other area of their life, they're learning and adapting, a lot of times reasonable, level-headed people, okay? But these people with the consequences from drugs and alcohol are accumulating consequences and they're not having a behavior change, which is very confusing for family members, also for us, right? So you would think if there's like a level-headed, reasonable, intelligent guy who gets 2 DUIs, you would expect him to never drink again, right? You would expect him to never get another DUI. Those are 2 huge consequences. So when there's that accumulation, a 3rd DUI, a 4th DUI, the family is baffled. The individual is usually confused as well, okay? So this is what we talk about, the accumulation of consequences. It's something that we look for when we're diagnosing an addict or an alcoholic. We're looking for an accumulation of consequences. Is this person's having issues with the law, with school, with relationships, with their health, with their money, okay? And they're not changing their behavior long term, okay? So some examples of the consequences we would see are hangovers, blackouts, risk-taking behaviors, injuries, lying, cheating, stealing, money problems, relationships problems, fights, academic issues, hygiene issues, sexual risks, legal issues, overdoses, health problems, and accidents. And this can, obviously, we could add to this list. This is just some examples. Okay, so because of those consequences, right? So you can imagine you're feeling the weight of these consequences on your shoulders. Okay, so I'll use myself as an example a lot. Like, I would wake up in the morning and I would just, I mean, that was the first thing you felt, was just the weight of the consequences. I feel sick again. I humiliated myself again. I'm broke again. I injured myself again. I lied again. Like, you're feeling the weight of these consequences on your shoulders. Okay, so what do you do as an intelligent, reasonable, strong-willed individual in every other area of your life? Okay, is you're going to go on what I call the heartbreaking journey of every addict and alcoholic throughout human history. And you're going to try to control this. You're going to try to cut back, control, and substitute. Okay, you're going to try to contain this thing. And as you try to contain it, it's going to get worse. So some examples of this would be, if you see addicts and alcoholics, doing things like, I'm taking a break for a month. I'm only drinking beer. I'm only smoking marijuana. I'm only drinking when I'm with my friends. I'm never starting before 5 p.m. I'm only drinking on holidays. I'm never drinking at work. I'm never using needles again. I'm only taking pills. I'm only going to be drinking when I'm wearing blue. Like, we do all types of things to try to control ourselves. We make all types of rules for ourselves. And a lot of times we try to substitute. So we have a drug of choice. So say our drug of choice is opiates. We might say, I'm only going to smoke marijuana. Or if our drug of choice is marijuana, we might say, I'm only going to drink. So we try all these different things to try to be able to use in moderation. But the thing with alcoholism and addiction is we can't use in moderation. The idea that someday, somehow, he will control his drinking or drug use is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker or user. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it to the gates of insanity or death. We alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drinking, and we know that no real alcoholic ever regains control. Okay, so if you're an alcoholic, these quotes here are like crushing, because all you want to do is to be able to drink or use in moderation. That's like, you want that more than your friends and family want it. You want to be able to continue to drink and use, and you want to do it in moderation. And what this is saying is that if you have the disease of chemical dependency, that is impossible. And if you continue to try, you will chase that delusion to the gates of insanity or death. All right, and this is the kind of like the experiment that we run over and over. Trying to prove ourselves an exception to the rule. So again, we call this the heartbreaking journey. It's the one where we're trying to control our use, usually failing, always trying to regain control. Eventually, we will make a resolution. So eventually the pain and the consequences will get bad enough that we will say never again. I don't want to ever drink again. I don't want to ever use again. And even when we get to this point, when we're saying never again, a lot of times we will pick up again, okay? And that brings us to the mental part of this disease. So what happens to an addict or an alcoholic who has feeling the weight of these consequences on their shoulders, who have cut back control and substituted, who have said, I'm never going to do it again? How do we get to here from where we stopped to over on the left side of the screen to where we start again? How does that happen? How do you get to a point of where you say, never again, I'm not doing this anymore, and then picking up that first drink or that first drug? Okay, and that, right, this bottom half of the circle here, this is the crux of the problem. Okay, so it's not just a physical allergy. It's not just about this accumulation of consequences, because eventually an addict or alcoholic will say, I don't want to do this anymore. And even after we've said that, we cannot stop. Okay, so we need to understand this piece of the puzzle as much as we need to understand the top. Okay, so the first part is the body, but the second part of the disease that we need to understand is in the mind. And this happens inside the mind of a sober addict or alcoholic. So this is what's happening within us when there is not chemicals in our body. Okay. So why do we take that first drink or that first drug that kicks into gear the craving for more? Why does that happen over and over and over again? Okay. So we're going to try to understand the bottom half of this circle. The first thing that's going to happen when an addict and alcoholic stops drinking or using is something called withdrawal. A lot of you probably know what this is. If you are physically dependent on a chemical substance, when you stop taking that substance, you will go through something called withdrawal. Depending on the substance that you are addicted to, it will depend on that substance, how dangerous the withdrawal actually is. But for almost every substance, it's at least uncomfortable. So for most addicts and alcoholics, if you're physically dependent on a substance, it's usually a good idea to get medical help to go through the acute withdrawal period, especially if you're dealing with withdrawal from alcohol or benzos or benzodiazepines. Those can be dangerous. Withdrawal is a terrible experience. I don't know if anyone on here has ever been through withdrawal. I've been through withdrawal multiple times. It's awful. And you would think that after having gone through withdrawal, getting all of those chemicals out of your body over the course of however long it takes, sometimes it's a few days, sometimes it's a few weeks. But that period of withdrawal, you get to a point where you are no longer addicted physically at all to chemicals again. You would think after that, no one would ever pick up again, right? Like imagine, I used to think about this myself. So have you ever had an aversion to a food because you ate it and then you got like physically ill because you ate it? And then every time after, when you see that food, you feel nauseous and sick, like you can't imagine eating that food again. So that's called an aversion. It's a normal and healthy psychological response to a food or a drink that made you ill. And what's shocking about addicts and alcoholics is that we can get so ill from our substances. We can go through withdrawal and be hospitalized for days suffering from our substance, and we still don't have an aversion to it, right? And that should tell you that there's something going on in our brains, like we're not connecting the dots correctly. There should be an aversion to these substances. But there isn't, no matter how bad withdrawal is. And believe me, it is bad. If you've never been through withdrawal, it's terrible. It's not bad enough to keep us sober. All right. And so that speaks to the mental aspect of this disease and how powerful it is. Okay. The second thing I think is important to recognize about a newly sober addict or alcoholic is we do not have coping skills. Because our coping skill leading up to this point had typically been our drugs or alcohol. So when we're sober, we don't like how we feel and we don't have ways of coping with it. So one of the things that is important about rehab, and I think whether it's outpatient or inpatient rehab, is you're learning to build like a toolkit of coping skills. And you're also learning that you can tolerate uncomfortable emotions. So you can be bored. It's okay. You can feel anxious. It's okay. You can feel sad. It's okay. So learning that you can, that those emotions are safe to feel, they're all right to feel, but also having some coping skills to deal with emotions when they're becoming really unpleasant, other than using your substance. So that's something that they put a lot of work into that when they're usually in inpatient or outpatient rehabs. Something I think is really, really important for family members of addicts and alcoholics, but also for alcoholics and addicts to understand is that if you have this disease, sobriety is uncomfortable, okay? Sobriety is uncomfortable. if you don't have alcoholism or addiction, this concept might be difficult to wrap your head around, but the way that I would describe what sobriety feels like prior to being in recovery is it's almost like a discomfort with the movement of time. Okay, you feel uncomfortable in your own skin, you feel restless, irritable, discontent, you feel like you always need something to look forward to, like you need something to get you from point A to point B. It's a really unpleasant, uneasy, kind of out of control feeling. And when we're drinking or using, we're looking for relief from the experience of sobriety. We're not just looking to get high. Our motivation is often for relief because the experience of sobriety is so uncomfortable. So, and this kind of speaks to when I spoke about what is a dry drug. So when an addict and alcoholic puts down the drink or the drug, what we're feeling is uncomfortable, dread, shame, and guilt, future tripping, which means fixated on what's coming next, fixated on what in the future is going to make me feel good. The next meal, the next cigarette, the next vacation. We feel like we're always waiting, restless, irritable, discontent, uneasy, always needing external things in order to feel okay, which can make you feel very powerless. I always need something outside of me to feel okay because inside I never feel okay. We can feel empty, alone. There's extreme mood swings, which can be very disorienting, not just for the people around us, also for us. The need for distraction. We often feel very resentful, anxious, and preoccupied. So we're looking for relief from this experience, and for us, drugs and alcohol work until they don't. Right? Now I'm sure that there are people who can relate to this, that they feel like this. But that they don't have the inclination to drink or use. And I think that it's entirely possible that you can have, one piece, you can have the physical piece, you can have the mental piece of addiction. But if you don't have both pieces, you don't have the physical and the mental, we typically won't see the disease progression. Okay. So, and if you have something like this, you might be inclined to other types of addictive behaviors if you don't get the type of physical response to drugs and alcohol that we see typically in addicts and alcoholics. Okay, so sobriety is uncomfortable. Even when you're sober, you are still suffering from the disease of addiction. And I think a lot of people do not understand that. They think, oh, as soon as my loved one puts down the drink or the drug, now they're able to enter into recovery. But if you have alcoholism or addiction, you put down the drink or the drug, that's typically when your problem starts. Okay, because even when you're sober, you are still suffering from the disease of alcoholism. Okay. A lot of times for addicts and alcoholics, when we put down the drink or the drug, we're going to start to see some other addictive behaviors come up as we're trying to cope with that experience of sobriety. So it's not uncommon for an addict or alcoholic to have some overlapping addictions. So having issues with workaholism, gambling, shopping, sex, cutting, binging, purging, pornography, shoplifting, even exercising. We see dieting, gaining, unhealthy relationships, and spending. So these things on their own are not necessarily a problem. I mean, like obviously shoplifting, that's not a healthy activity. What you're going to be looking for if you're in early recovery is if you start having obsessions about any of these behaviors, that they start taking over like your time and your priorities. So if you start choosing exercising over being with friends and family, if you're thinking about exercising throughout the entire day and when you're going to get your next, like when's the next time you're going to get to the gym, and you're obsessing about your image and what other people are lifting or how fast you're running, and it's becoming consuming. And a really good red flag is if you're keeping secrets about any of these behaviors, it can very easily shift into an addiction. So those are just things that you want to watch out for. If you are diagnosed with alcoholism or addiction, it doesn't mean that you can never you can't go shopping, or that you can't go to the gym, or that you can't play video games. It's just to be aware of the fact that if you're newly sober and you don't have a healthy outlet, it's not uncommon that you might want to utilize something in an unhealthy way, and you just want to be honest about it with your community and your sponsor, your therapist, that sort of thing, so you can stay on top of it. Okay, it's really, we see a lot where unfortunately with in particular with young women, but also guys, that they'll put down the drink or the drug and then an eating disorder will come up. And it's just kind of like this, it feels like whack-a-mole, like you get one addiction under control and now you're dealing with another. And so that can feel really like defeating, but it's just different symptoms of the same untreated disease. So we want to always keep that in mind, that these are just symptoms of alcoholism and addiction. And just because you've put down the drink or the drug doesn't mean you've dealt with the mental part. And so you're going to continue to see symptoms. Okay. Another thing that you're going to notice if you're a newly sober addict or alcoholic is you will be having obsessions about drugs and alcohol, and you will be glamorizing it, which is, I think it's impressive. Like, I often think about, the last few years of my drinking, I had a terrible time. It was mostly, the entire thing was mostly a nightmare. I had very few happy memories of drinking the last few years. It was all really disgusting and pathetic and sad. And but when I was newly sober, I had a hard time recollecting the hundreds of negative memories I had with alcohol. And it was very easy for me to recall the 3 good memories I had with alcohol. So that's like this glamorization. Very easy for me to forget how often I humiliated myself, how sick I would get, how frequently I cried myself to sleep. Very easy for me to remember those first few years of drinking, the nights that I didn't embarrass myself, which were few and far between. So the ability to glamorize some within, even though the majority of it is awful, is a really telltale sign of alcoholism and addiction. And in fact, it's something that if you have a relationship with someone who's in early recovery and you recognize them doing that, just to try to keep your feet grounded in reality. So, if you have someone who's like, well, what am I going to do for fun? All my friends go to the bar every night. What am I going to do for fun? And you can hear that kind of like self-pity, that glamorizing the idea of going to a bar and hanging out with your friends, reminding them of the reality of what it's like when they go to a bar, the importance of recovery. These types of glamorizations, they're common, but they're just not rooted in reality. And we have to really remember that. Okay. We are unable at certain times to bring to our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defense against the first drink. Okay, so when you really understand this, so there was a time when I think I was like 2 months sober. I was not doing anything to treat my disease. I was just white knuckling it. And, one day, I'm sitting uncomfortable in my sobriety, and my brain gives me gives me the brilliant idea that, it won't be as bad this time, and I can get away with it if I drink in New York. And because I was so uncomfortable, and because I was just like waiting for an excuse that sounded good enough, I jumped on that idea. And I went and drove myself all the way to New York, and I relapsed up in New York. I got incredibly sick. I had to be institutionalized. And in hindsight, when I would think about that, it was frightening to me that the idea of you can get away with this in New York felt like a good idea to me. Like, that felt like a sane and rational idea. That was how I experienced that thought. And what that highlights is that even if I have the resolve, I don't want to drink again. I don't ever want to drink again. I've been sick. I've made promises. I've humiliated myself. I know that I can't control my drinking, but at certain times you're unable to bring to your consciousness with sufficient force the memory of how bad it was. So I couldn't bring to my mind the memory of how bad it gets when I drink. And all I could think about was the relief I get from a drink. And that was enough for me to rationalize driving to New York and relapsing. And so when you really accept or understand this passage, what it just means is like, you don't really have a shot. So you can fight your addiction all you want. You can sit and white knuckle, but at some point, you will not be able to bring to your consciousness with enough force the memory of how bad it is, and you will be without defense against the drink. Okay, and this is when I speak to the idea that this is not a matter of willpower. It's not a matter of choice. As someone, I consider myself a relatively intelligent and strong-willed person, and I did not have a choice if I picked up a drink or not. And that's really like disorienting to accept as a newly recovering person, because your disease makes you feel like it's a choice. It actually, you almost like feel empowered when you pick up a drink, because you're like, I'm choosing this for me and my body. I get to decide. When you're an addict or an alcoholic, you have lost the power of choice in drink. You're not making these decisions anymore. You are a slave to your own behavior. Okay. So in the mind of an addict or alcoholic who's newly sober, we're dealing with guilt and shame. We are lacking coping skills. We're uncomfortable with the movement of time. We're often struggling with other addictive or compulsive behaviors. We got a lot of resentment and fear. We're dealing with the mental cravings or obsessions. We're preoccupied and glamorizing it. And on top of that, we have something called the addictive voice. And this is a part of our brain that is constantly and relentlessly firing out excuses, rationalizations, and justifications to pick up and drink again, or to pick up and use again. And it's like all day, every day. Okay. So it's like, it'll be different this time. It wasn't so bad. You can have just one. I deserve it. I can control it. I'm not as bad as so-and-so. Nobody understands. Poor me. There's no point in even trying. I can handle just one. I'll stop tomorrow, or I'll stop next week. This is totally impossible. Nobody will know if I do this. It's not a disease. The biggest one that, we'll tell her, the biggest lie we'll tell ourselves is, I don't care. Who cares? I don't care what this does to my future, or my body, or my family. Because if you ask an addict or an alcoholic, by the time they get to a rehab, they care. But that addictive voice will tell us that we don't care. And so these are the ways that our disease speaks to us. So inside of our brain, we're suffering, we're feeling, the resentment, the fear, the lack of coping skills, the discomfort, the guilt, the shame, all of these things. And we have an addictive voice battling us at all times. It'll be different. You can control it. It's not a disease. You're not as bad as your friends. And I mean, this is the environment that we exist within when we are sober without treatment. Great. So the addictive voice, meaning the curious mental phenomenon that parallel with our sound reasoning. So parallel with our every reason not to drink, knowing you're an alcoholic, knowing the promises you've made to friends and family, remembering those consequences, the curious mental phenomenon that parallel with your sound reasoning, there inevitably ran some insanely trivial excuse for taking that first drink. Okay. Our sound reasoning fails to hold us in check, and the insane idea wins out. I mean, this is really defeating. So regardless of all the good intentions, all of those strong reasons you have not to pick up a drink or a drug, all you need is one dumb idea, and it will trump all your sound, sane ideas. Okay, because at certain times you are without defense against the first drink. Okay, the addict or alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. Willpower and self-knowledge would not help in those strange mental blank spots. Okay, and that's what the experience is. It's kind of like these strange mental blank spots. Okay, and then you have to pick up the pieces all over again. All right, so here we go. We take that first sip, that first hit, that first pill, kicks into gear the craving for more, so we can't predict how much we're going to have. We start abusing substances more and more because we're feeling corrected, and we start to experience unmanageability or consequences, so we stop. But then sobriety is uncomfortable. We're having these obsessions of the mind. Our addictive voice is going, and eventually that dam breaks, right? It passes our parallel reasoning. That one trivial excuse will run out, and we'll rationalize a drink or a drug again. And then that will kick into gear the whole cycle all over. So then we have the allergy, the unmanageability, the discomfort in sobriety, the addictive voice, and we kind of spiral around and around this thing. So that when we talk about what does it mean to be powerless, this is what we're describing. It's a body that cannot tolerate drugs and alcohol, and a mind that cannot stay sober. So coupled together, we're in a pickle, right? So this is what it means when we describe powerlessness. I have a body that can't tolerate drugs and alcohol. I have a mind that cannot stay clean and sober. Okay, so here's some quotes from the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Addicts and alcoholics have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We'll be unable to stop drinking or using on the basis of self-knowledge. You cannot trust your brain to keep you sober. The organ you use to think with is diseased. And so this is what you have to accept in early recovery, is that your brain can't be trusted to keep you sober. And that is a really, really hard thing to accept. Okay, so what does not work when treating alcoholism and addiction? I just want to highlight this first. So these are the things that typically do not work when we're trying to get out of this cycle of addiction. Willpower. So you can't will yourself to be sober and content. You can't will yourself to stop thinking about drugs and alcohol. You can't will yourself to be a non-alcoholic, just like you can't will yourself out of a depression. You can't will yourself out of alcoholism. Okay, morals. This is not a moral failing. Most addicts and alcoholics I know are very moral, like wonderful people. This is a disease. It's not a character trait. Values. Self-knowledge, so knowing you're an addict and alcoholic is not enough to stop the cycle. Promises to friends and family, even if they're totally like authentic and real, like you can honestly promise people you'll never drink again and mean it. But then the addictive voice is going to, and that one dumb idea is going to trump all your sound reasoning, and you'll rationalize the drink or the drug again. So a lot of times family members are like, you lied to me. But it's not like there wasn't an intention of lying some of the time. Not all the time, some of the time. Losses alone, intelligence or IQ, memories of how bad it was, desire to stay sober, pain, humiliation, resolutions to stop, and control plans, and love for family. You know, throughout human history, addicts and alcoholics have loved their families. You would not say to someone with bipolar disorder, don't you love your kids enough to not be bipolar? Don't you love your parents enough to not be bipolar? So you really can't say to an addict and alcoholic, don't you love me enough to not have alcoholism? It is very normal for the family to feel betrayed, to feel really frustrated and angry. Those feelings are valid. But this is not a matter of lack of love for the family. That's not, unfortunately, the cure for alcoholism and addiction isn't love your family more. So we just want to remind people that, you know, this is to try not to take the disease or the progression of the disease personally. Okay. So this is what doesn't work. Okay, well, we know that these things don't work. So this is step one. If you're familiar with the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, step one is we admitted we were powerless over drugs and alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. I have a body that can't tolerate drugs and alcohol. I have a mind that cannot stay sober. And the solution to this problem does not lie inside of me. I'm powerless. Okay, that's step one. Okay. It can feel like a little bit like you're defeated. You know, I have a body that can't tolerate drugs and alcohol, a mind that can't stay sober. And the solution, the problem does not lie inside of me. I'm powerless. How am I ever going to get out of this? Okay. Well, step one, the solution is not inside of me. But step two is I'm willing to believe there's a solution outside of me. I'm willing to believe there's a solution. It just isn't me doing this by myself. That's all you need for step two. I'm willing to believe there's a solution. It just isn't me versus this by myself. So you really have to open yourself up, be vulnerable, accept help. Okay. You have to be willing to take suggestions. You have to be willing to do hard things. But step two is really just kind of trusting that there is a solution. It just isn't you battling this disease on your own, which is typically what we want to do. Most addicts and alcoholics don't want help. We initially want to learn how to moderate our drug and alcohol use. And then secondly, we're usually deeply ashamed and we're very afraid of someone taking drugs and alcohol away from us forever. So those are things that really can hold us back. There's a lot of defense mechanisms that we rely heavily on: minimization, denial, projection. These all can, rationalization, these all can kind of prevent us from authentically seeking help. So it's not easy to do these. The first two steps are hard to do, to accept that you are powerless, that you can't drink successfully, you can't use successfully, you can't stay sober on your own, you're going to drink or use again. The organ you use to think with this disease, you cannot rely on it to keep yourself sober. And there is a solution, and it requires you to be vulnerable. It requires you to give up your substance. It requires you to ask for help and trust. I mean, these are hard things for someone to do within a diseased mind. That being said, if you go to a rehab, if you go to a meeting, this is what everyone around you is going to be doing. So that's why in early recovery, we see addicts and alcoholics. We try and get people into groups and around each other so that they can see this is, you're not alone. You have that reduction in shame. You have that instant connection because of the familiar type of suffering. But yeah, again, these steps are challenging to do. And it does take a lot of courage, a lot of insight, a lot of vulnerability, and space away from your substance. Okay. And this embracing of powerlessness can be really tricky. And so I think it's really important to understand what it is that we're talking about, because the 12-step program is truly about accessing power. It's about empowering yourself. It's just that we have to accept that we're powerless over drugs and alcohol before we can do that. A lot of people see that first step, they see the word powerless, they see the word God, and they're not interested. So you really need to have that, I think, that understanding of what alcoholism and addiction is. What do we mean by these words? In order for people to at least be curious about the program and be vulnerable and open up. All right, so I like to close with the Serenity Prayer. If you haven't seen this before, this is what a lot of meetings close out with. So this is really common. You hear this in recovery a lot. It says, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So with this, it's about, we have to accept the things that we can't change about our bodies. We're having this different reaction to drugs and alcohol. We're having this different experience with sobriety, but we need to have the courage to change the things we can. You can get out of the cycle of addiction. It is entirely possible. This is a treatable condition, right? So if you go at this by saying, I don't know the difference, right? I'm going to try to fight my disease on my own, by myself, white knuckling it. You're probably not going to have any success. But if you recognize the pickle you're in, that you're powerless over drugs and alcohol, that your body's having a different reaction, that sobriety is very uncomfortable for you, and you have the courage to change, to step out of the cycle, to ask for help. This is a very treatable disease once someone gets to that point. If someone is truly willing and motivated, recovery is an awesome experience. I wouldn't change the fact that I'm an alcoholic. at this point. I love being in recovery, and it's a really beautiful way to live. So I always want to end on a note of hope, understanding what addiction is, not minimizing it, not diluting it. In the end, will be empowering, and also allows for you to treat your disease in a way that I think is more effective, lending more compassion to yourself. And the truth, which is that recovery, not only is it possible, but it's really awesome. And if you haven't met people in recovery yet, if you feel like all you've experienced so far is addiction, I want to be a person who can present like a face of recovery. Recovering people are everywhere. We're all over the place. Most of us aren't talking about it all the time, but we're everywhere. And so I certainly want to end on a note of hope. So if you have someone in your life who's struggling, this is a very treatable disease, and recovery is awesome.